I knew something was wrong the moment my own front door refused to recognize my key. That thought still echoes in my mind whenever I remember that Sunday afternoon. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 71 years old, and until that day, I believed there were some lines family members simply did not cross. I had spent the morning exactly as I had for years. I attended church, sat in the third pew from the front, sang the hymns I knew by heart, and stayed afterward to chat with friends in the fellowship hall. Before leaving, I picked up a small plate of homemade cookies from the church bake sale. It was an ordinary Sunday. The kind of quiet day that makes you feel grateful for simple things. The drive home took about 15 minutes. The Indiana sky was clear, and the neighborhood looked peaceful when I pulled into my driveway. Nothing seemed unusual. I carried my Bible under one arm and the cookies in the other hand as I walked up the front steps. Then I inserted my key into the lock. It would not turn. I frowned and tried again. Nothing. I checked to make sure I was using the correct key. I was. I tried once more. The lock remained stubbornly still. At first, I thought the mechanism had broken. Old houses have old problems. But then I noticed something. The lock itself looked brand new. My stomach tightened. I stepped back and stared at the door. The brass finish was different. The shape was different. Someone had replaced it. While I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, movement caught my eye. I looked toward the living room window. My daughter-in-law, Tasha, was standing inside the house. She was holding a coffee mug and looking directly at me. For a second, I felt relief. Surely there had been some misunderstanding. Surely she would come open the door. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was. Then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that makes you realize you are the only person who does not understand the joke. I walked to the window and raised my hand. Tasha slowly opened it a few inches. "The key does not work," I said. She took a sip of coffee before answering. "I know." The words hit me harder than I expected. I stared at her. "What do you mean you know?" Her expression never changed. Maybe it is time to think about living somewhere else. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I had heard her correctly. This was my home. The house my late husband and I bought 42 years earlier. The house where my son grew up. The house where every Christmas, every birthday, every family memory seemed to live inside the walls. Yet there I stood on the porch like a stranger. Tasha glanced behind her and then back at me. "I think this arrangement makes more sense," she said calmly. Then she closed the window. I remained frozen on the front steps, holding a plate of cookies and a key that no longer opened my own front door. Then I noticed a folded piece of paper taped beside the doorbell. My hands trembled as I peeled the folded paper from the wall beside the doorbell. The tape came loose easily, as if whoever placed it there expected me to find it right away. I unfolded the page and stared at the message. It was only a few lines long. The words were polite on the surface, but the meaning underneath felt cold. The note explained that changes had been made to the living arrangements and that future discussions should happen after Michael returned home. There was no signature. There did not need to be one. I knew exactly who had written it. I looked back toward the window, but Tasha was gone. The curtains were closed. I stood there for another minute, hoping the entire situation would suddenly make sense. It did not. Eventually, I carried my Bible, my purse, and the untouched plate of cookies back to my car. I sat behind the steering wheel and simply stared at the house. The flower beds I planted every spring were blooming along the walkway. The porch swing Robert built with his own hands still hung exactly where he left it. Everything looked familiar. Yet somehow, I had become the outsider. My first call was to Michael. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. He was driving a delivery route 2 states away and often could not answer immediately. I left a message asking him to call me as soon as possible. I kept my voice calm. I did not mention the locks. I did not mention the note. I simply said I needed to speak with him. Then I waited. An hour passed. No call came. Another hour passed. Still nothing. By late afternoon, I realized I needed somewhere to go. I called my closest friend, Helen Parker. Helen and I had known each other since our children were in elementary school together. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. 20 minutes later, I was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea in my hands. As I explained what had happened, Helen's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. More than once she asked if there had been some misunderstanding. I wished there had been. That evening, I borrowed Helen's guest room. It was comfortable and welcoming, but I could not sleep. For 42 years, I had ended every day in the same house. I knew the sound of every floorboard. I knew how the afternoon sunlight fell across the dining room. I knew exactly where Robert's favorite chair sat in the living room. Now I was lying awake in a different home, wondering how everything had changed so quickly. Around 10:30, my phone finally rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen. Relief rushed through me. I answered immediately. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He sounded confused. Tired. And when I told him I had been locked out of my own house, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said 6 words I never expected to hear. Mom, I did not know anything. For several seconds, I could not speak. I sat on the edge of Helen's guest bed holding the phone against my ear while Michael's words echoed through my mind. He did not know anything. Part of me wanted to feel relieved. Another part felt even more unsettled. If Michael truly had no idea what happened, then Tasha had acted completely on her own. What do you mean you did not know? I finally asked. Michael let out a long breath. I could hear highway noise in the background. Mom, I have been on the road since Friday. Tasha never told me she changed anything at the house. His voice sounded sincere. Confused. The same way he sounded as a teenager whenever he was trying to understand a problem he had not expected. I explained everything. The new locks. The note. The conversation through the window. The longer I spoke, the quieter he became. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said something that surprised me. Mom, that is not what we talked about. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? Another pause followed. Tasha mentioned that maybe someday we should discuss different living arrangements. But that was all. Nobody talked about changing locks. My stomach tightened. Different living arrangements. The phrase sounded strangely familiar. It reminded me of the note taped beside my door. It reminded me of the careful language people use when they do not want to say what they really mean. Michael promised he would drive home as soon as he completed his delivery route. The earliest he could arrive was the following evening. Before ending the call, he apologized several times. I told him the situation was not his fault. The truth was, I was no longer sure whose fault it was. The next morning, Helen insisted on driving past my house with me. We stayed inside her car and parked across the street. I did not want a confrontation. I simply wanted to see whether anything looked different. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed a moving truck parked in the driveway. My heart skipped. 2 men carried several boxes into the garage while Tasha stood nearby speaking with them. From that distance, I could not tell what was inside the boxes. But I recognized something else immediately. Several pieces of patio furniture were missing from the backyard. The flower pots near the porch had been rearranged. Small changes. Yet each one felt like another step in a process I did not understand. Helen watched quietly beside me. Finally, she spoke. Margaret, are you sure there is not something else going on? That question stayed with me all day. Later that afternoon, while sorting through old papers I kept in a storage box at Helen's house, I found an envelope I had completely forgotten about. It had been mailed 6 months earlier and accidentally mixed in with other documents. The return address belonged to a law office. My pulse quickened. I opened it carefully and pulled out a single page. At the top was a subject line that made my hands tremble. Inquiry regarding residential property ownership. I read the letter 3 times before the meaning fully settled in. The document was dated 6 months earlier. According to the law office, someone had contacted them requesting information about ownership rights connected to my property. At first glance, the inquiry appeared routine. But one detail stood out immediately. The person making the request was not me. It was not Michael either. The name listed on the form belonged to Tasha. I felt a chill move through me. 6 months. That meant whatever was happening now had not started recently. It had been unfolding quietly behind the scenes for a very long time. Helen watched my expression change as I continued reading. "What is it?" she asked. I handed her the paper. As she scanned the page, her eyes widened. "Margaret, why would she be asking about ownership rights?" I wished I knew. The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur. Questions seemed to multiply faster than answers. Why was Tasha interested in property records? Why had she contacted a law office? And why had she never mentioned any of it to me or Michael? By early evening, my phone rang. Michael was finally home. He asked if we could meet somewhere neutral before he went back to the house. We agreed on a small diner located about 10 minutes from town. The place had been there for decades. Robert used to take me there every Friday night after football games when Michael was in high school. When I arrived, Michael was already sitting in a booth near the window. The moment I saw him, I noticed how exhausted he looked. The past few days had clearly taken a toll on him. After ordering coffee, I showed him the letter. He read every word carefully. Then he read it again. The color slowly drained from his face. "I never saw this before," he said quietly. "I never knew she contacted an attorney." I believed him. His reaction was too genuine to fake. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Michael surprised me by reaching into his jacket and pulling out a folded receipt. "There is something else," he said. The receipt came from a storage facility on the other side of town. The rental agreement listed Tasha as the account holder. I frowned. "What is being stored there?" Michael shook his head. "I do not know. I only found this in our car yesterday." Another piece of the puzzle. Another secret. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Tasha was doing things she never discussed with either of us. Later that night, Michael finally returned to the house. I remained at Helen's place waiting for an update. Around 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from him. Only 4 words. "We need to talk." My heart immediately began racing. I called him, but he did not answer. 5 minutes later, another message arrived. This one was longer. According to Michael, several rooms inside the house looked completely different. Furniture had been moved. Family photographs were missing from walls. Boxes filled with household items were stacked in the garage. And tucked inside one of those boxes was a folder containing copies of documents connected to my home. Documents neither of us had ever seen before. Then came the final sentence. The sentence that kept me awake for most of the night. "Mom, I think she was planning something much bigger than changing the locks." I barely slept that night. Michael's message replayed in my mind over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those missing family photographs, the boxes in the garage, and the mysterious documents connected to my home. By sunrise, I was already sitting at Helen's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Around 8 o'clock, Michael called. His voice sounded strained. "Mom, I found more papers." My stomach tightened immediately. He explained that after Tasha went to stay with a friend for the night, he continued looking through the boxes stored in the garage. Inside one folder were copies of property maps, market value estimates, and printed emails discussing nearby development projects. None of the documents were addressed to him. Every one of them appeared connected to the future value of my neighborhood. The more he described what he found, the clearer one thing became. This was never about making life easier for me. Someone had been studying the property itself. Later that morning, Michael met me at Helen's house. The moment he walked through the door, I could see the conflict on his face. He looked exhausted and disappointed at the same time. We sat at the dining room table and carefully reviewed the papers together. Several pages contained handwritten notes in the margins. Some mentioned possible sale values. Others listed renovation estimates and projected profits. Then I noticed something unusual. One page contained a highlighted sentence discussing corner lot properties positioned near a future commercial expansion zone. My house sat exactly on such a lot. Michael rubbed his forehead. "Mom, I swear I never saw any of this before." I believed him. The confusion in his eyes reminded me of the little boy who used to come home upset whenever someone lied to him at school. This was not the face of a man hiding a secret. This was the face of someone discovering one. Around noon, Helen suggested we speak with an attorney before making assumptions. The advice made sense. Emotions were running high, but facts mattered more. Fortunately, I knew someone. Rebecca Hayes had been a trusted family attorney for years and had worked with Robert on several legal matters before his passing. I called her office and explained the situation. To my surprise, she agreed to meet us that very afternoon. Rebecca listened carefully as we presented everything we had gathered so far. She examined the property inquiry letter, the notes, the printed emails, and the photographs Michael had taken of the folders. The more she reviewed, the more serious her expression became. Finally, she set the papers down and folded her hands. "Margaret, there is something important you need to understand." The room fell silent. "Based on what I am seeing, someone appears to have been researching ways to gain influence over decisions involving your property for quite some time." Michael stared at her. I felt my pulse quicken. Then Rebecca opened a file cabinet behind her desk and removed a folder with my late husband's name printed across the front. What she said next changed everything. "Before Robert died, he left instructions in case anyone ever challenged your right to that house." Rebecca placed the folder on her desk and opened it carefully. The moment I saw Robert's handwriting on several pages, my throat tightened. Even after 3 years, seeing his notes still felt like hearing his voice. Rebecca removed a document protected inside a clear sleeve and slid it across the table. "Your husband was a very careful man," she said. "He believed in preparing for possibilities before they became problems." Michael leaned forward as Rebecca began explaining what Robert had done. Years before his passing, he updated several legal documents connected to the property. At the time, I barely paid attention because Robert always handled paperwork. I trusted him completely. Now, sitting in that office, I was grateful that I had. According to Rebecca, the house belonged solely to me. Not jointly. Not partially. Completely. More importantly, Robert had added specific protections designed to prevent outside pressure from influencing ownership decisions. Any attempt to transfer, alter, or challenge the property's status without my direct involvement would trigger additional legal review requirements. Rebecca tapped the document with her finger. "In simple terms, Margaret, nobody can quietly maneuver this house away from you." Relief washed over me. For the first time since that terrible Sunday afternoon, I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to stabilize. Michael looked equally relieved. But Rebecca was not finished. She reached into the folder again and produced another document. This one was newer. Her expression became more serious. "There is something else you need to know." She explained that several months earlier, a representative from a real estate consulting group had contacted her office requesting general information about properties in our area. At the time, the inquiry seemed harmless. However, after reviewing the documents Michael found, she recognized similarities. Some of the same development projections appeared in both sets of paperwork. The same future expansion plans. The same property value estimates. The same focus on corner lots like mine. A pattern was beginning to emerge. Someone had invested considerable time researching my house. The realization sent a chill through me. This was no longer about one impulsive decision. This looked organized. Planned. Deliberate. After leaving Rebecca's office, Michael drove me back to Helen's house. During the drive, neither of us spoke much. Both of us were processing everything we had learned. Finally, as we pulled into the driveway, Michael broke the silence. "Mom, I think I need to have a serious conversation with Tasha." I nodded. "I think you do." That evening, he returned home. I spent the next several hours sitting beside Helen in her living room trying not to stare at my phone. Around 9 o'clock, Michael finally called. His voice sounded different. Not angry. Not confused. Determined. He told me he had confronted Tasha about the property documents, the attorney inquiry, and the storage unit. At first she denied everything. Then she admitted some of it. But according to Michael, her explanations created even more questions. She claimed she was trying to help the family prepare for the future. Yet she could not explain why so many things had been kept secret. Near the end of the conversation, Michael mentioned one final discovery. While searching through additional files stored in the garage, he found a business card tucked inside a folder. On the back was a handwritten appointment date scheduled 2 weeks before the locks were changed. The name printed on the card belonged to a property acquisition specialist. And beneath the name was a handwritten note that made my heart sink. Preliminary transfer discussion. The words written on the back of that business card stayed with me for the next 2 days. Preliminary transfer discussion. The phrase sounded professional. Harmless, even. But placed beside everything else we had uncovered, it felt like another piece of a plan that had been quietly moving forward without my knowledge. Rebecca agreed. When I showed her a photograph of the card, she immediately asked for the name of the acquisition specialist. Within 24 hours, she had gathered more information. The man worked for a regional company that specialized in purchasing residential properties located near future development zones. My house fit that description perfectly. Suddenly, all those reports about neighborhood growth and rising property values made even more sense. Someone believed my home would become significantly more valuable in the near future. The following afternoon, Michael stopped by Helen's house again. He looked exhausted. The strain of the past week seemed written across his face. We sat on the back porch while Helen brought us iced tea. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Traffic. Church. Neither of us wanted to immediately discuss the situation waiting between us. Finally, Michael set his glass down and looked at me. "Mom, there is something I need to tell you." His voice was quiet. Careful. He explained that after their argument, Tasha admitted she had attended several meetings connected to property investments. According to her, she believed she was helping secure the family's future. She claimed rising expenses and financial pressure had made her think about long-term solutions. But there was one problem. The numbers did not add up. When Michael asked direct questions about debts, accounts, and financial obligations, her answers kept changing. Some information matched. Some did not. The uncertainty only deepened. Later that evening, Rebecca called with another update. During her research, she discovered that an information request concerning my property had been submitted more than once. Not once. Multiple times. The request stretched back nearly a year. Each inquiry focused on ownership structures, transfer procedures, and development potential. The pattern was impossible to ignore. This was not a sudden idea. It was a long-term interest. After ending the call, I sat quietly by Helen's living room window. Outside, the sun was setting over the neighborhood. Families were walking dogs. Children were riding bicycles. The ordinary rhythm of life continued while my own world seemed suspended between questions and answers. Then my phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Attached was a photograph. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The image showed a conference room inside a local business center. Several people sat around a table covered with property maps and documents. I recognized one face immediately. Tasha. She was seated near the center of the table. More surprising was what sat directly in front of her. A large aerial photograph of my property. Beneath the image, someone had written a handwritten note. 3 simple words. Potential acquisition target. I stared at the photograph for a long time. The conference room looked ordinary. Beige walls. Fluorescent lights. A table covered with paperwork. Yet the image felt heavier than any document Rebecca had shown me. Because this time I was not looking at theories or possibilities. I was looking at Tasha sitting beside people who appeared to be discussing my property as if it were already part of their plans. The next morning, I met Rebecca at her office. I handed her my phone without saying a word. She studied the photograph carefully. Her expression remained calm, but I noticed her eyes narrowing as she zoomed in on different sections of the image. Finally, she pointed toward a logo visible on one of the folders. It belonged to the same regional development group connected to the acquisition specialist. The connection was becoming impossible to dismiss. Rebecca set the phone down and folded her hands. Margaret, I think it is time to stop asking whether there was a plan. My stomach tightened. You think there was one? She nodded slowly. I think there may have been several. Those words stayed with me throughout the day. Several plans. Not one mistake. Not one bad decision. A series of choices stretching back months. Perhaps longer. Later that afternoon, Michael called and asked if we could meet. His voice sounded different again. Not confused this time. Determined. We met at a small park near the river where he used to fish with Robert when he was a boy. The weather was warm. Families walked along the trails. Children chased ducks near the water. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, every conversation seemed to carry a weight neither of us could ignore. Michael handed me a folder. Inside were copies of bank statements he had recently discovered. Most were ordinary. Household expenses. Utility payments. Mortgage information on a property Tasha had once owned before they married. But several transactions stood out. There were consulting fees. Meeting expenses. Payments connected to property evaluations. None of them had ever been discussed with him. Michael looked out across the water. I do not know who she became, he said quietly. I felt a pang of sadness hearing those words. Because despite everything, he still loved his wife. And that made every discovery hurt even more. Before we left, Michael told me something else. The previous evening, Tasha had finally admitted attending multiple meetings related to development opportunities. However, she continued insisting everything had been done for the family's future. The explanation might have sounded convincing if not for one problem. She still could not explain why she changed the locks. She still could not explain why she never discussed any of this openly. That night, as I sat in Helen's guest room, my phone buzzed with an email from Rebecca. Attached was a report she had requested from a title research service. I opened it immediately. Several pages appeared. Ownership history. Property records. Legal descriptions. Everything seemed routine until I reached the final page. There, buried near the bottom, was a note indicating that someone had recently requested preliminary information regarding a future ownership transfer scenario. The request was dated 3 weeks before I was locked out of my own house. The date on that report kept pulling my attention back to the same conclusion. 3 weeks before I stood on my own porch unable to unlock my own front door, someone had already been exploring transfer scenarios involving my property. Not ownership questions. Not neighborhood research. Transfer scenarios. The wording mattered. Rebecca agreed. The following morning, I met her at her office again. She had spent several hours reviewing the newest documents. When I arrived, she already had a yellow legal pad filled with notes. "Margaret," she said, "there is a difference between preparing for possibilities and preparing for outcomes." I sat down slowly. "What does that mean?" Rebecca slid several papers across the desk. They showed timelines, inquiry dates, consultation requests, property evaluations. Individually, none of them proved wrongdoing. Together, however, they painted a very different picture. The activity stretched across nearly 11 months. 11 months. I felt my stomach tighten. That was almost an entire year of planning, research, meetings, and conversations that happened without my knowledge. As I drove home afterward, I found myself thinking less about the house and more about trust. Houses were wood, brick, glass, and concrete. Trust was something far harder to rebuild once damaged. That afternoon, Michael called and asked if he could come see me. We met at Helen's house. The moment he arrived, I noticed something had changed. He seemed calmer. Not because the situation had improved, but because he had finally made a decision. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and placed a small envelope between us. "I found this in the storage unit," he said. Inside were copies of meeting schedules, business cards, and handwritten notes. One page immediately caught my attention. It contained a list of action items. Most of the wording was vague. Property review. Ownership research. Future planning. Then I reached a line that made my pulse quicken. Assess resident relocation options. I read it twice. Then a third time. Michael watched my reaction carefully. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he shook his head. "Mom, I do not understand how any of this became normal." Neither did I. Later that evening, another unexpected development occurred. Tasha called me directly for the first time since changing the locks. Her voice sounded controlled. Careful. She said she wanted to talk. She said there had been misunderstandings. She said people were drawing conclusions without hearing her side. I listened quietly. Then I asked a simple question. "Why did you change the locks?" Silence filled the line. Not for a few seconds. For nearly half a minute. When she finally answered, she did not address the question. Instead, she spoke about stress. Finances. Future security. Family pressures. Everything except the locks. Everything except the one decision that started all of this. After the call ended, I sat alone in Helen's guest room staring out the window. The sky had turned dark. Streetlights glowed across the neighborhood. My phone buzzed with a new message from Rebecca. Attached was a scanned document she had just obtained. At the top appeared the name of the acquisition company. Beneath it was a projected timeline. And scheduled immediately after a line labeled ownership transition was another entry that made my heart stop. Property listing preparation.